Welcome to the ARCO Forum of the Institute of Politics of the Kennedy School of Government. This evening's event is sponsored, solely in case there are confusions, by the Institute of Politics and the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies. My name is John Coatsworth. I'm a professor in the History Department and the director of the David Rockefeller Center. And it's my pleasure and privilege and honor to introduce our speaker this evening and to chair the question and answer period that will follow his address. As we all know, official relations between Cuba and the United States have not risen much above a deep chill. Sometimes they've fallen into a hard freeze since the triumph of the Cuban Revolution in January of 1959. Full diplomatic relations have yet to be restored. The economic embargo imposed in 1961 and 2 by Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy remains in effect and has even been tightened in recent years, and most U.S. citizens and residents are prevented from traveling legally to Cuba by the provisions of the Trading with the Enemy Act, a World War II piece of legislation that makes it a crime to purchase goods and services produced in Cuba. What Americans see much less clearly is that beneath Washington's official hostility is a dense web of subterranean, official, as well as informal ties and collaborations that has developed and even become totally routine in areas as diverse as drug interdiction, immigration policy, telecommunications, as well as academic and scholarly exchanges. At Harvard, just to take a local example, hundreds of students and dozens of faculty members have traveled, all perfectly legally, I might add, to Cuba in recent years, while growing numbers of Cuban scholars and scientists have visited Cambridge, some for extended visits to collaborate with their Harvard counterparts, and this year for the first time to teach courses. The terrorist attacks on Washington and New York on September 11th, as you know, evoked strong condemnation and expressions of sympathy from Cuban authorities. As the United States reorients its post-Cold War foreign and security policies in the wake of these events, the distracting legacies of earlier eras may become even more difficult to sustain. That, in a sense, is the issue that our guest this evening will address. He is a distinguished diplomat and one of Cuba's senior Washingtonologists. Anyone in this country who has tried to figure out what people in Washington are doing or what they might be thinking of doing tomorrow will understand what a difficult and demanding career our guest embarked upon when he graduated from the Higher Institute of International Relations in Havana in 1977. It is true that he spent 5 years practicing on the Canadians as second secretary at the Cuban embassy there, but I don't believe this could have helped him very much. In any case, since 1979, he has divided most of his time between the North American desk at the Cuban Foreign Ministry in Havana and the Cuban Interest section in Washington. I first met him during an earlier tour when he was first secretary of the section, of the Interest section, between 1995 and 1999. Since then, and until just a few weeks ago, he headed the North American desk at the Foreign Ministry. In all of these positions, Ambassador Dagoberto Rodriguez has worked with great professionalism, and I must say with an openness and candor for which diplomats are not universally acclaimed, to promote better relations between our two countries. So I hope you will join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest this evening, Ambassador Dagoberto Rodriguez.
Thank you, John, for your kind words. First of all, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University for inviting us to be here today. And I would like to thank especially also to Professor John Coatsworth, the director of the David Rockefeller Center, Steve Reifenberg, its executive director, and Lorena Barberia, its Cuba program associate, who made our visit and our presentation at this place possible. We also like to thank the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School of Government, and very especially, of course, all of you for being here this evening. Thank you very much. As you know, in 1959, Cuba began a socioeconomic transformation of major proportion, fueled by a long-lasting struggle for independence and a commitment to sovereignty. The people of Cuba rejected the century-long record of foreign intervention, the saga of corrupt dictatorships such as Batista's, and startling inequalities that existed for most of the Cuban people. The outcomes of our great social transformation are not perfect, as no human creation is, but has been guided by our firm belief that economic growth must go together with social justice. During the 60s and the 70s, Cuba was able to carry out huge economic and social changes aimed at forging a society where the basic and fundamental human rights for food, shelter, health care, work, and education were guaranteed to all Cuban citizens. Illiteracy was eradicated, access to all levels of education is free, Cuba's overall educational level is 9th grade, and 50% of the total Cuban labor forces has a senior high school degree or above. The number of universities and colleges grew from 3 to 44, and today we have more than 700,000 people with universities or college degrees. The healthcare system lowered infant mortality and increased life expectancy. Cuba has 11 times more medical doctors than 40 years ago, and the infant mortality rate last year was about the same that of the US. 94% of the population has electricity services, and everybody is guaranteed the basic commodities. Although there were ups and downs, triumph and setbacks, Cuba stayed focused on the path it had chosen. But then, 10 years ago, the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the socialist bloc made many people believe that the demise of the Cuban Revolution was inevitable, given Cuba's high dependence on foreign trade with those countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist system had a very strong impact on the Cuban economy. When Cuba's economic relations with these countries disappeared, our country did not only face a reduction of 75% of its import overnight, but also almost a total loss of its main markets. The GDP dropped 35%, and the budget deficit reached 1/3 of the GDP. Then, the US government decided to reinforce the economic blockade against Cuba, a policy which began right after the victory of the Cuban Revolution in January 1959, long before the first revolutionary measure has been adopted, and long before Cuba had proclaimed itself a socialist country. At that time, as early as on April 6, 1960, a State Department memorandum was very explicit about the intention of that policy, and, I quote, "Every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow the government." Close the quotation. But this policy did not prevent Cuba to continue for 30 years its own development in the economic and social areas. In this respect, the blockade was a complete failure. In the 90s, the US approach was that while the blockade had not worked before, the time had come for it to work, at the moment when precisely Cuba was facing harsh economic difficulties. In this context, the Torricelli Act was passed. This act prohibits any ship that docked in Cuba to enter U.S. port during a period of 6 months, and also bans subsidiaries of U.S. companies in third countries to trade with Cuba. Before that, the trade with those companies of American companies in said country was about $700 million, and 90% of that figure in food and medicine. But that was not enough. In 1996, the Extraterritorial Helms-Burton Act was passed, thus strengthening the blockade and establishing sanctions for foreign enterprises investing in Cuba. To cope with this difficult situation, Cuba decided to speed up the process of changes and reform by reshaping its economy and commercial relations and focusing on the increase of productivity and efficiency. After wide popular consultation, the Constitution of the Republic was amended to extend the form of property ownership in domestic finances. Process restructuration began, and measures were adopted to cut the budget deficit. We legalized the possession of foreign currency, encouraging the recovery of our national currency. Agricultural shifted toward greater involvement of the cooperative property. Most of the former state farm, which owned at that time 75.2% of the arable land just 8 years ago, have become now in cooperative, and today the private and non-state entities account for 67% of the land. By September of 1993, other economic measures led up to an expansion of self-employment. Now, in total, about 150,000 persons have embraced self-employment. Today, Cuba is involved in a process of reorientation and decentralization of its foreign trade. Joint ventures, economic associations, and producers can now directly engage in foreign trade. Cuban foreign trade partners are no longer concentrated in one regional market or in any particular country. Europe has become our first foreign trade partner with 48% of the total value. France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Russia are our main trading partners in this region. Cuba trades with Latin America, the Caribbean, and Canada, which by the late 80s accounted only for 6% of total general trade, reached over 36% in 1998. Thus, the Americas, with the exception of the US, is our second trading partner. In 1995, the Cuban Parliament passed a new foreign investment law. This legislation provides the legal framework for joint venture. In terms of foreign investment, we have almost 400 major joint ventures in 36 branches of the economy, 35% of them concentrated mining, tourism, telecommunication, light industry, food industry, construction, and agriculture. To strengthen this new policy, Cuba has signed investment protection and promotion agreements with 47 countries, 13 of which are European nations. Due to all these measures, and again all odds and predictions, in 1994, the Cuban economy had a very modest growth of 0.7%, which stopped the downward trend of the previous year. Since 1995 up to year 2000, the Cuban economy had an annual average growth of 4.4%. The growth in 2000 was 5.6%. Last year, sugar production grew at 7.3%, agriculture 14%, and tourism, which is now the leading industry in Cuba, 16%. Tourism, which has replaced sugar as Cuba's biggest income generation sources, had gross revenues of $2 billion last year. Most tourists come from Canada, Germany, Italy, France, Spain, and Mexico. We are also working with new markets, including Brazil, Belgium, Sweden, the UK, and Japan. The economic recovery has been stronger than expected, but I do not intend to glamorize the economic recovery in Cuba, and on the contrary, shortage of many basic, including food and medicine, persist. This shortage imposed many hardships and sacrifices on our people. The Cuban economy continued to suffer from a serious hard currency deficit due to the rising international market prices for imports such as food and medicine, while prices for our main export declined. But we are pleased and proud because all the economic measure and adjustment has been undertaken, always trying to preserve the social development of our country. So, these encouraging results has been achieved while keeping favorable level in healthcare, education, and social security. These three sectors represent 62% of the state budget, in contrast to the 5% allotted to the defense spending, which has been cut 50% during the last 5 years. In Cuba, despite the shortage in medicine and medical equipment, the healthcare system covers the entire country and is available free of charge for all Cubans. Last year, our country showed the lowest infant mortality rate in Latin America and one of the lowest worldwide, 7.2% per 1,000 live births. Life expectancy is 74.8 years old, with 77,000 physicians. Cuba has one of the highest rates of doctors per inhabitant in the world. Additionally, as a new way of sharing our modest achievement in healthcare, over 25,000 Cuban doctors have served in more than 50 countries, mainly in Africa and Latin America. In foreign affairs, Cuba has tripled its diplomatic ties since 1959. Cuba has full diplomatic relations now with 172 countries. If we survive and started to recover in spite of the US blockade, it is easy to imagine what our enormous possibility would be if we had normal economic relations with the US. The United States is the only country in the world that has an embargo against Cuba, considering that the US is the richest and most powerful nation and our closest neighbor. The lack of interaction put a tremendous strain on our people. The establishment of the blockade by the US has implied for Cuba the loss of preferential prices in terms of sugar export, the lack of financial means, the substantial increase of transportation costs because of the relocation of its trade, the overprices that it should pay to acquire product, and the deactivation of facilities and equipment because of the lack of raw material and spare parts, among other consequences. Today, neither we have access to the US market, nor we can buy from any American subsidiaries in third countries, as we have to go to other markets to buy the product Cuba needs. The significant increase of distance implied higher transportation and insurance costs. At the same time, the reprisal taken by the US against cheap dock in Cuba port have led to the enforcement of surcharges and higher rate between 15 and 20%. The prohibition to Cuba to use the US dollar in its international transaction and to have deposit in third countries' bank account in this currency has provoked, among other things, that we get credit or loans at higher rate, and sometimes the average is 15%. In the case of medicine and medical equipment, Cuba has to purchase them in other markets at prices 20 to 30% higher than those that could be obtained in the US. And in many cases, we cannot buy in third countries new medication and medical supplies that are manufactured or patented in this country. These are only a few examples of the impact the US blockade has on the Cuban economy and on the Cuban people. While the blockade has always been unjustified, today it has run out of pretext. According to the presidential decree issued in 1962, this policy was officially established under the authority of the Trading with the Enemy Act in the context of confronting the Soviet Union and other socialist countries. So we could ask ourselves what could possibly justify this policy today. Where is the enemy? Where is the Soviet Union? If the Cold War has been over for 10 years, how this open war attitude against Cuba can be explained? if the Pentagon has stated that Cuba posed no significant threat to the U.S. national security, how this attitude can be justified then? Let me point out that blaming Cuba because American companies did not receive compensation for the nationalization process has been one of those pretexts to justify the U.S. blockade. This affirmation bears no foundation at all. The fact is that Cuba has compensated all companies from other countries that were affected by the same process. And if Cuba has not done the same with American companies and citizens, it is because of the U.S. blockade that canceled the sugar quota and cut all commercial relations between our two countries, thus depriving Cuba of the means for paying due compensation. Our socialist system cannot also be the cause of the blockade, since the United States has trade, economic, or diplomatic relations with all other socialist countries. It is well known the international rejection of the U.S. unilateral sanctions against Cuba. Not only did the United States General Assembly pass last year a resolution 9 times in a row, almost unanimously calling the end of the U.S. economic and trade blockade against Cuba, but also 167 governments opposed the blockade. In addition, many voices in the U.S. representing the broadest sector of the American society, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the American Legion, have called for the end of this policy. The Cuban people is not the only victim of this blockade, but also many Americans cannot understand why they are banned from traveling to Cuba, the only country in the world upon which such restrictions are applied. Many others cannot understand either why they cannot take advantage of the economic possibilities that the Cuban market provides. American businessmen and farmers are losing many economic opportunities because of this current blockade. This year, Cuba will buy around $1 billion only in food and agricultural products all over the world, when all of them are produced in the United States. In 1996, despite of the enactment of the Helms-Burton Act, more than 400 brands of the U.S. Product were registered in Cuba, and during the last few years, more than 1,000 American businessmen have visited our country. Some of these companies, no matter their former property holding in Cuba, are much more interested in doing business than in being used as a pretext for continuing this aggressive policy. 40 years have elapsed. The world configuration has dramatically changed. The Cold War is over. The Soviet Union no longer exists. In a world where integration and globalization provide the condition to work, a policy of embargo is out of place. We think that in the case of Cuba, the U.S. government is not pursuing a policy in accordance with its national interests or with those of the American people. It is known that the majority of the members of the U.S. Congress, different sectors of the society, and the American public opinion itself are in favor of changing such policy. However, far from expressing this feeling, which increasingly expands the American policy towards Cuba, continue to be hostage of the interests of the Cuban-American minority and its allies. We have the conviction that both countries could benefit from each other if we had better cooperation in areas of mutual interest, including those where there is a potential danger for our two countries. One of those areas is the anti-narcotic interdiction. Despite the absence of an agreement, whenever it is necessary, Cuba cooperates with the U.S. authorities fighting drug trafficking. Taking into account Cuba's geographical position, its commitment against drugs, and the role it could play to stop drug smuggling into the U.S., in 1999, Cuba proposed the U.S. government to increase and improve to the maximum the level of cooperation between our two countries. Since then, we have been waiting for an answer from the U.S. side. Cuba has already signed cooperation agreement on narcotic interdiction with more than 29 countries, many of them from the Caribbean basin, and we still hope to reach that level of cooperation with the U.S. Another area that requires true cooperation is migration. legal procedures to migrate from Cuba to the United States are in place, but the combination of the so-called dry food, wet food policy with the expanded scope of the Cuban Adjustment Act of 1966 continue to encourage people to leave the country illegally. This has resulted in a dramatic increase of alien smuggling operations with terrible consequences and heavy costs in human life. Among the few agreements existing between Cuba and the United States, you will find the Migration Accord signed in 1994 and 1995. The stability of both agreements depends upon a strict compliance and implementation of their spirit and letter, aimed at returning all illegal immigrants intersected at sea to Cuba and stopping to grant permanent residence to those arriving in the U.S. by irregular means. Another current topic, fight against terrorism. After the terrible events on September 11 in the United States, Cuba not only expressed its deepest condolences to the American government and the American people, but also strongly condemned this action and terrorism in all its forms, and ratified its willingness to cooperate with all countries in the world, including the U.S., for its total eradication. In fact, several times in the past, Cuba has cooperated with the U.S. government and has provided information about terrorist action against the United States or against Cuba, many of them, unfortunately, planned and launched from the American territory. Also, the Cuban government, following its traditional position, recently reiterated that the Cuban territory will never be used for terrorist action against the American people and that everything within our reach will be done to prevent it to happen. Refusing to cooperate with Cuba and keeping Cuba in the State Department terrorist list since 1982 without any reasonable argument does not make sense anymore. The United States could benefit from a better relation with Cuba in many other ways. It does not exclude, for example, the possibility of taking advantage of the changes and the opening that is taking place in the Cuban economy. It is our hope that in the future, without any blockade, American companies will also be able to be part of our trade and investment process. Other sectors in which bilateral cooperation could be possible are protection of the environment, joint scientific research in different areas, and prevention of environmental and natural disasters, just to mention some of them. Cuba is willing to continue promoting and encouraging all kinds of exchanges, contacts, and dialogue between our two peoples. Just last year, about 77,000 Americans visited Cuba as part of a student, academic, scientific, cultural, religious, and sport exchanges project, among others. We have also undertaken a new policy towards Cuban living abroad, including, of course, the Cuban-American community, aimed at normalizing relations with their native country. Last year, for example, a record number of more than 136,000 Cubans living in other countries, mainly Cuban Americans, visit the island. We think the time has come for Cuba and the United States to make important and fundamental decisions for the benefit of our two countries and our two peoples. Cuba is ready and willing to discuss any issue with the United States and reiterate its desire to maintain normal relations with this country. Our only condition is absolute respect for our dignity, independence, and sovereignty. While we hope to have normal relations, we think it is up to the United States to make unilateral changes in the current policy. It would not be realistic or viable to ask Cuba for concession, neither to set conditions in order to start a negotiating process with the United States. This is our position, and those who think that Cuba wants to perpetuate the present situation and to justify with the blockade our inefficiencies and economic mistakes are totally wrong. We are working hard and will continue to do so in the future with the confidence and optimism. We prefer to look to the future and stop living in the past. We are sure that someday sooner rather than later, Cuba and the United States will enjoy normal relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Before beginning the question and answer period, I want to invite all of you cordially to a reception in honor of Ambassador Rodriguez on the 5th floor of the Taubman building, which my knowledge of Harvard geography is a bit weak, at least on this part of the campus. It's behind me, right, across the yard. Take the elevator up. You're all invited. The floor is now open for questions. There are microphones at either side of the hall. Could you please find your way to a microphone if you have a question? Try and keep your question as brief as you can make it, and introduce yourself when you are called in. Whoops. The first question.
Hi, my name is Michael Pinheiro. I'm a student in the undergrad, senior, and a government major. Basically, Mr. Rodriguez's speech seemed to posit the Cuban-U.S. bilateral relationship as a case of Cuba extending an open hand and the American nation withdrawing it. I would like to bring light to a quote from Fidel Castro, which he said May 10th upon a visitation to Iran. Iran and Cuba, in cooperation with each other, can bring America to its knees. The U.S. regime is very weak, and we are witnessing this weakness from up close. We can tear down the United States. This is May 10th, 2001. This seems to be difficult for you to reconcile your message and the message of your leader, and I want to know if you could do that for me.
Thanks for the question. I think there are enough examples, different statements from Fidel Castro, other leader of the Cuban Revolution, many other officials, stating our will to develop a normal relation with the United States. It doesn't mean that we, in any way, are saying that we are in this position to change our system in Cuba just to satisfy to anybody. What we are saying is that we will keep being what we are, but we want to have normal relations. It means that to have a civilized relation, it means that we will not interfere, and we have interfered at any moment in the past in the U.S. business, and the U.S. have no right to interfere in the Cuban business. That is all about. That is what we are talking about. The American people, for many, many years, have kept very close and strong relations with Cuba. We share so many things in common in history during 200 years that there is a nonsense for having a different relation. We are sure and we are convinced that the American people, in a majority, the American people doesn't agree with the policy of the U.S. government on Cuba. So, just to put clear things, we want normal relations with the United States. We want to have normal relations with the American people. It doesn't mean that we accept in any way that the United States have the right to interfere or change things in Cuba. That's it.
Or it appears the rhetoric of one's leaders. Yes. Oh, sorry. Someone here.
Good evening. My name is Clay Pell, and I'm a freshman at the college. I was wondering, how fair do you think the American media is towards Cuba? And how fair do you think the Cuban media is towards America?
Well, there has been many misunderstandings and manipulation of the information during many years. And precisely one of the aims of encouraging exchanges between both countries to have more communication, more exchanges in cultural, in academic, scientific fields is precisely just to diminish this ill feeling that sometimes appears in the media in both countries. But I think that we should say at the same time that the last few years, growingly, the media in the U.S. have reflected in more positive way the need of changes in the policy towards Cuba. That is something that we have to recognize. And the way is just precisely continue developing those exchanges. It's the only way if we want to be reflected in the media, in the public opinion, the essential of the nature of our relationship in the future.
Yes. Please be sure to introduce yourself.
My name's Nico. I'm a sophomore at the college. You spoke a little bit about higher drug prices and so on in Cuba as a result of the embargo. I was wondering if you could talk about how that pans out in terms of actual health care in Cuba. I was particularly interested in severe diseases like AIDS or something. Are you able to deal with it as we would in a lot of other countries like Europe and America?
Higher cost of drugs in Cuba, how it has affected healthcare, AIDS and so on.
Well, that is something that affects a lot in Cuba, especially because we have to buy many medicines that are very needed in Cuba in places like Europe or China or other places. And that put a lot of pressure and difficulties on the Cuban healthcare system. But at the same time, I should say that Cuba is devoting more than 30% of the budget precisely to the healthcare system to keep that free of charge for everybody and trying to find all the medicine needed in anywhere. We look for that in any place that we can buy it just to solve that problem. We continue having that. It's really difficult to get some medication out of the United States. But I can assure you that the basic medicine that the population need are available right now.
Yes, here.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm
Name,
Jonathan
please.
Richmond. I left Cuba with very many positive impressions, an impression of a nation of compañeros who truly love their country. At the same time, I had some disturbing experiences, and I want to ask you why, Mr. Ambassador, is it necessary for the people of Cuba to fear their government? And one evening, I checked in at a local hotel. I was driving across Cuba, and I checked into a small hotel, went for dinner. 2 hours later, I came back. The desk clerk was there with his wife. They were in tears. They were shaking. They were in a state of nerves. I had to sit with them for 2 hours. They had allowed me to check into a hotel that was apparently not authorized for Westerners. Someone had reported them to the police, and the behavior was as if their lives were about to come to an end. I've rarely seen such fear on someone's face. I've seen Cubans reticent about their relationship with their government on a number of occasions. Could you explain why it is that Cubans must fear their government?
Your comment surprised me because I think any American visiting Cuba could realize how free are the Cubans just to exchange with any visitor. Right now, almost 2 million persons has visited Cuba, and they can move freely in Cuba, exchange with Cubans, and maybe there are few people in the whole Latin America who could be more open than Cubans culturally, not just as a matter of our heritage. So I don't know really your impression or your experience where it comes from, frankly.
Yes.
My name's Tony Vila, a sophomore at the college. In light of the fact that many of the advocates of dropping bans, economic bans on other communist countries give their reason as it will help expose them to our capitalistic system, and that before the revolution, economic interference was seen as just as detrimental as America's political interference, what makes you think that the dropping of the ban on the Cuban government will have completely positive effects for the nation of Cuba?
In this world, globalized world, we don't conceive any nation that have no relation with the rest. This is the most normal and civilized thing to do. But if, capitalism is so good and so strong, and we are not disputing that, why the United States not decide just to open up relationship with Cuba? And instead of having this isolation policy, have a policy to send as many Americans as possible to Cuba, send American goods to Cuba, and to have the American press installed in Cuba and have a normal relation. So we are not, in any way, we are trying to offend American society or any other. What we are saying is that all human beings have the right to relate each other in openly and free way. And that is our position. We are proud of our system. I must confess. We think that what suits Cuba is precisely the kind of system that we have. We are not saying that that system has to be, in place in the United States or other place. We are just talking for, our people. And we have decided, in majority and overwhelming way, that is the system that we wanted. And we express that, every 2 years and a half when we have election, partial election, and every 5 years when we have general election. Election which are general, secret, ballot, direct, and especially with no money interference, no people lobbying, for one candidate or another, and that is the kind of system that we really wanted. But at the same time, we say that we don't fear to have relationship with anybody, because our people is a very educated people, and the revolution precisely has been an emerging Cuba precisely for giving a different life to Cuban and to prepare them for the new time and the new world that is coming. This millennium, to be prepared to understand the international phenomenon is something very important. We really believe that we are able to have normal relations with the United States and continue being what we are.
Let me follow up with that question, if I may. Part of the question was asking this. Suppose the embargo ended and free trade and capital flows existed between the United States and Cuba. What would Cuba do to prevent some of the distortions and bad effects that globalization seems to have had, noticed frequently in speeches by Fidel Castro and others, in other parts of the world?
I really think, as I mentioned before, that the first thing is just the education of the people, the ability of the people to understand this phenomenon, and that is our most, I would say, secret and powerful weapon, just the ideas, just a new type of person that is able just to understand those phenomena. You are right. If maybe in a scenario of normal relation between Cuba and the U.S., Cuba will face many challenges, no doubt about that. Not just politically, but also economically, culturally. But we are willing to face that challenge. We want to face tomorrow. If that encounter of culture provoke changes in Cuba, that's fair, no problem. What we cannot accept is trying to promote changes through political manipulation, just trying to impose those changes. If, as a result of this, normal connection between both countries are changes in Cuba or in the U.S., that's fine.
Yes, over here.
Good evening. My name is Ted Leonard. I'm a member of the July 26th Coalition, which is a Cuba solidarity group in the Boston area. And I just have a question, and that is on, recently there was a trial in Miami of 5 Cuban nationals that I believe were falsely charged on spying and imprisoned. And I just wondered if you could go into what their case is about and what people could do about it.
That is an example of how difficult it is to establish a cooperation at the current situation between Cuba and the United States. Cuba has been for many years cooperating against terrorists with the United States. We have been passing along information to the U.S. authorities about different action against U.S., against Cuba, or against other countries. In the 90s, at the end of the 90s, there was a positive exchange, we suppose at that time, between the Cuban authorities and the American authorities, and we pass a lot of information regarding terrorist action in South Florida and other parts of the United States. The response of the American government at that time was to look into and find the source of the information that we had, and as a result of that, five Cubans were imprisoned in Florida, and they are now in jail in Florida as a result precisely of their action against terrorists in South Florida.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ruben Fernandez. I'm from the Graduate School of Design. I'm a Master in Urban Planning student. As a Cuban American not born in Cuba, I'm a bit curious to find out what your impression is about the role of second-generation Cuban Americans, as well as the second-generation Cubans. What role can they play in terms of furthering US-Cuban relations, in terms of the fact that, for the most part, our two generations are separated and isolated? And do you see them as perhaps being sort of a bridge to help Cuba transition to the next phase in this sort of international problem?
There is a growing Cuban American community, just the people who came in 1959, but after that, many has come to the United States. Even now, every year is coming 20,000 per year. And we really believe that all Cubans living abroad have an important role in the future of Cuba. Very important role, not only in the economic fields, but also in the life of the Cuban society in general. The only thing that Cuban living in Cuba requests is respect to the will of the Cuban people living in Cuba. You don't have to agree with the Cuban Revolution to have a normal relation with Cuba. You can have any opinion you want to have, but you must, at least it's our opinion, respect what the Cubans living in Cuba are doing. And this has been in the past, the major obstacle maybe for having a normal relation. But time has changed, as I said, and now, last year, 120,000 Cuban Americans visited Cuba. And they went there without any problem, just stayed in Cuba for the time they wanted to stay, have a normal interaction with their family, their friends, and that will be the normal and common things in the future, we really think, because it is a nonsense for a community with so strong engagement with the island to be apart. And I reiterate, we do feel that there is an important role for the Cuban living anywhere in Cuba now and in the future. Now, I think that the major task for any Cuban living in Cuba or living in the United States is to have the blockade lifted. And why I am saying that? Because it's the major obstacle for having normal relations. It's the major obstacle for having normal communication with their families and their relatives in Cuba. And of course, it's the major obstacle for having the relationship normalized.
Yes.
My name is Fidel Mariano Covas, and I would like to know what your opinion is on how you would interpret the change of heart towards the Catholic Church upon the Pope's visit a few years ago. Well,
there is an important growing and constructive relationship between the Cuban government and the Catholic Church in Cuba. In the first year of the revolution, there were misunderstandings, there were difficulties, and especially in the 60s, there was a difficult relation. But after that period, and especially in the 90s, when the Cuban Constitution was amended, just to adapt to the times and to precisely to push for this process of normalization of relationship with the Catholic Church, and especially after the visit to Cuba of the Pope, the relationship has continued growing, and frankly, if you ask me to define at present, I would say that it's a positive, constructive, and good relationship.
Yes.
Hi, Mr. Rodriguez. My name is Juan Carlos Rasco, the son of Cuban-born parents who were forced into exile over 40 years ago. My question to you is, you spoke of communism being the system that the people have chosen, that it's the system that you have chosen for yourselves. How is it that the people have chosen that system when their votes are virtually meaningless and they really have no true say in their government?
He says, how is it that you say that socialism is communism is the choice of the people when they can't vote?
Well, I don't know if you know that from 1976 there are elections in Cuba. And all officials in Cuba have to go through this process from any single parliament till up to Fidel Castro. And they have to get 51% of the vote to be elected. And those elections are free, those elections are secret ballot, are direct, and the people elected in Cuba can be revoked the following day if the constituents, if the people who elect them change their mind. In Cuba, there is a transparent process. Maybe it's not perfect. We are sure that it's not a perfect democracy. But for us, it's the one that suits our needs right now. It's not just a representative democracy, which it is, but also it's a participatory democracy when everybody have a participation in the decision-making process. For example, the constitution that you mentioned was adopted in Cuba in the 70s, was made through a referendum with a participation and attendance of 98% of the population. All major measures adopted in the 90s as part of the economic process for reform were consulted with the Cuban population, measure by measure. Even many of them that were seemed to be very appropriate to the moment that Cuba was living in the middle of the crisis, and the people said, the majority of the people said that they didn't want and they were not adopted. For example, one of them was the imposition of the income tax in Cuba. But that was discussed in every workplace in Cuba, in every school, in every neighborhood, and most of the people say, well, we don't agree with that, and that was not adopted. That is the way that Cuba functions, through a consensus process. It's the only way for a country to survive. If you take into consideration that Cuba is a very small island, it's a very poor country, it's so close to the United States, the country that classifies Cuba as an enemy, to survive and to keep the kind of government that we have, of course, we really need to count with the consensus, with the majority of the population.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yes.
Hello, my name is Robin Malavalin. I work at Bridgewater State College, south of here, about half an hour. And a couple of years ago, I took a group of students to Cuba, and it was a very eye-opening experience for them. They realized that a lot of what they had learned in the United States was not true, and some of the questions that you've been asked reflect some of that, some of the misinformation that we have in the U.S. about Cuba, for example, about elections. My understanding is that Cuba is still on the U.S. list of terrorist nations. And if that's...
Afghanistan is not on the list, actually.
It's not.
But Cuba is.
Whew. And so what I'm wondering is, can you anticipate some of the ways in which, with this war on terrorism that we're doing, that Cuba may be affected by it? What might be some of the policy changes or some of the other ways in which Cuba could be affected by this? Thank you.
Well, the event of September 11 was really, dramatic and terrible even. And maybe that would show to the American government that this is such a serious problem that you cannot make politics with that. And maybe it's time just to review that and just to define that Cuba is not an enemy of the United States. Cuba never has sent to any terrorist action or prepared any terrorist action against the U.S. So maybe the time has come just to review this situation. In time, Cuba has continued offering our will of cooperation in this area, and we will continue doing so.
Final question.
Thank you. My name is Christine Tellian. I'm a sophomore at the college. As any two nations come together, for negotiation or to build diplomatic relations, such as in this case, both sides need to compromise. And I was just wondering what concessions Cuba is willing to make in order for the U.S. to feel comfortable with revoking the embargo.
We really consider that this is hard to ask Cuban concession, since we are not blockading the United States. We are not sending terrorist action against the United States. So ask concession to Cuba, I think that is really hard, What we are saying is that in good faith we are proposing to negotiate to solve all our problems. It doesn't matter how difficult it could be. Maybe one could say, well, the compensation to the American owners, and for us that's fine. That have to be included in the negotiation. That have to be solved. Cuba have paid to the rest of the people who were affected after the revolution, from Canada, France, Switzerland, and many, many other countries. So. In good faith, we are saying we are open, we are ready to sit down and to discuss our difference. But concession, frankly, we don't see that we have to make concession at this point to the United States.
Ambassador Rodriguez, thank you very much.